Picture this: the Battle of Marengo, June 14th, 1800. Napoleon Bonaparte, the First Consul of France, is in full, chaotic retreat. His army is shattered. The Austrians have broken his lines completely. His career, his future, his revolution. All of it is about to end in disaster on an Italian plain. The guns are thunderous. The situation is hopeless. Then suddenly, a single division appears through the dust and smoke. It is led by a general who wasn't supposed to be there. He rides up to a despairing Napoleon, surveys the catastrophe, and delivers the most famous line of the campaign. This battle is completely lost, but there is time to win another. The man who spoke those fateful words was General Louis Desaix, and his name is the key, the missing piece to one of the greatest, most carefully constructed myths Napoleon Bonaparte ever built. When we remember the Battle of Marengo, we remember it as the turning point, the moment a young first consul, fresh from seizing power, cemented his rule over France and laid the groundwork for an empire. We picture Napoleon's singular genius, a flawless campaign planned and executed by a single mind, a masterstroke that confirmed his destiny. This narrative is powerful. It is taught in military academies. It is the version Napoleon himself spent years perfecting, commissioning paintings, editing bulletins, and silencing dissent. And it is almost entirely a fabrication. The truth of what happened on that bloody Italian plain is far more complex. It is a story of desperation, of catastrophic miscalculation, and of a victory that was snatched from the jaws of absolute defeat by one man. This is not the story of Napoleon's triumph. This is the story of the man who paid for it with his life. By 3 o'clock in the afternoon on June 14th, 1800, Napoleon was not winning. He was decisively, comprehensively beaten. The Austrian commander, the 71-year-old Baron von Melas, had already retired from the field, wounded and exhausted, but convinced the battle was over. He had left his subordinates to merely sweep the French from the field. Napoleon's divisions, the veterans of Italy and Egypt, were broken. His infantry was streaming in retreat for miles. His cavalry was exhausted. His reputation, his political future, and the very existence of the French consulate were collapsing in the dust alongside his army. The battle was lost. This is the story of the other battle, the one that began at 5 p.m., the one that Louis Desaix won. To understand Desaix, you must understand how profoundly different he was from the men who surrounded Napoleon. He was not one of the flashy, ambitious, often greedy generals who would later become the empire's famous marshals. He was a minor aristocrat by birth who had passionately embraced the ideals of the Republic: liberty, equality, and duty. He was quiet, almost austere in his habits, utterly indifferent to wealth and political intrigue, while others, like Murat or Lannes, schemed for glory, titles, and looted treasure. Desaix seemed to want only to serve France. He was perhaps the last true Republican hero. His military talent, however, was second to none. It was in the grueling Egyptian campaign of 1798 that his character was forged in the eyes of the army. While Napoleon fought the major battles near the pyramids, Desaix was given the grueling, thankless, impossible task of pursuing the Mamluk cavalry into the deep deserts of Upper Egypt. He marched his men hundreds of miles, enduring unimaginable heat, thirst, and constant, brutal guerrilla warfare. But it was how he governed that defined him. In an occupation often marked by French brutality and arrogance, Desaix was different. He paid for supplies. He forbade looting, often enforcing the rule with his own sword. He sat and listened to local sheikhs and imams, studied their laws, and administered justice so fairly that the Egyptian people, his enemies, gave him an honorific title, Al-Sultan al-Adil, the just Sultan. This was the man Napoleon trusted, not just for his tactical brilliance, which was immense, but for his character. Desaix was the rare subordinate whose talent Napoleon did not fear, because he knew it was allied to a profound, incorruptible loyalty. He possessed none of the political ambition of Moreau, none of the unpredictable vanity of Murat. He was pure capability. He was the perfect soldier. And as Napoleon's own star rose, as he schemed his way to becoming First Consul, he knew that Desaix was the one man he needed at his side to secure his new regime. This is the story of that man, the true hero of Marengo, the man who saved Napoleon from ruin, and whose reward was to be methodically erased from his own victory. The French invasion of Egypt in 1798 was a fantasy of Oriental glory wrapped around a core of cold, strategic calculation. Napoleon Bonaparte, the young Republican general, brought not just 40,000 soldiers. He brought 167 scientists, artists, and historians intending to civilize the Nile. But the dream quickly soured. After the Battle of the Pyramids, a stunning display of European firepower against Mamluk cavalry, the campaign bogged down. The French fleet was annihilated by Nelson at the Battle of the Nile, stranding the army. This was no longer a conquest. It was a prison. While Napoleon consolidated his power in Cairo, struggling with urban uprisings and the complexities of occupation, he gave the most difficult, thankless task to the one general he knew could handle it, Louis Desaix. His mission was to take his division south, deep into the unforgiving desert of Upper Egypt. His target, Murad Bey, the charismatic Mamluk leader who had escaped the pyramids with thousands of his best riders. Murad Bey had to be destroyed. Desaix was, in effect, ordered to chase a ghost through a furnace. What followed was a campaign unlike anything the French army had ever experienced. This was not the set-piece warfare of Europe, with its rolling fields and predictable sieges. This was a war of endurance, a war against the landscape itself. Desaix's division, perhaps 10,000 strong, marched south into a blinding, featureless inferno. The heat was beyond anything they had ever known. Soldiers wrote of metal buttons becoming too hot to touch, of leather cracking and soles melting on the sand. The Mamluks were the finest cavalry in the world, fighting on their home ground. They would appear out of the heat haze, a whirlwind of steel and fury, crash against the French infantry squares, and then vanish back into the desert before the French could properly respond. They harassed his supply lines. They poisoned wells. They ambushed his patrols. It was a brutal, relentless war of attrition, fought for oases and river crossings. Desaix adapted. He had to. He mounted his infantry on camels to create hybrid camel-cord units that could move almost as fast as the Mamluks. He learned to march his men at night, often for 8 or 10 hours at a stretch, to avoid the suicidal daytime heat, navigating by the stars. He pushed his division with a relentless drive, covering hundreds of miles in weeks, surprising the Mamluks who believed no European army could survive, let alone advance, in their domain. His soldiers, scorched by the sun, their blue Republican uniforms bleached to rags, their faces covered in sores, began to revere him. He wasn't asking them to do the impossible from a tent. He was marching with them. He was sleeping on the sand beside them. He was sharing their meagre rations. He was one of them. But tactical brilliance was only half the story. It was Desaix's character that truly set him apart from every other general in the French army. In Cairo, Other commanders like the infamous General Dupuy were imposing brutal requisitions, insulting local customs, and treating the Egyptian population with a colonial arrogance that invited hatred. Uprisings were met with mass executions. Mosques were desecrated. This was occupation by terror. Desaix, in Upper Egypt, chose a different path. It was a choice born of both pragmatism and a deep, genuine integrity. He issued ironclad orders. There would be no looting. Any soldier caught stealing from a local civilian would be severely punished. Sometimes, it was rumoured, even shot. When his army entered a village, he insisted that all supplies, grain, water, livestock, be paid for, in cash, at fair market rates. This was simply unheard of. Armies of the 18th century, especially revolutionary armies, lived off the land. They took what they needed. Desaix's policy was so alien, so shocking, that at first the local Egyptian villagers couldn't believe it. They would flee, hiding their grain, expecting the French to pillage and burn. Slowly, word spread up and down the Nile. This one French general was different. He kept his word. He sat not just with his officers, but with local sheikhs and imams, often in their own homes. He listened. He spoke to them with respect, inquiring about their laws, their customs, their grievances, often through interpreters, but always with patience. He learned basic Arabic phrases. He ensured his men respected religious sites, posting guards at mosques during prayer. In a land defined by centuries of rule by the sword, this was a revelation. The Egyptians saw this small, unassuming general. He was slight of build, with a shy, almost awkward demeanour, and a face badly scarred by a sabre cut from the Rhine campaigns. And they saw something they had never seen in a conqueror: justice. They gave him a name: Al-Sultan al-Adil, the just Sultan. This reputation became his greatest strategic weapon. While Napoleon faced constant bloody revolt in Cairo, Desaix's region in Upper Egypt stabilised. The guerrilla war against his supply lines began to fade. Why? Because the local population, seeing that Desaix protected them from the chaos and even from the remnants of Mamluk misrule, stopped supporting Murad Bey. They began to sell supplies to the French willingly. They offered intelligence. They preferred the predictable justice of this one French general to the anarchy that had preceded him. Desaix had not just beaten the Mamluks in battle, he had won the hearts and minds of the population, a full 150 years before the term would become a military cliché. He had pacified a region larger than many European countries, not just with the bayonet, but with integrity. Napoleon, back in Cairo, watched all of this with profound admiration. He was a cynic in many ways, a man who believed most people were motivated by fear or self-interest. He used terror as a tool. He manipulated men's ambitions. But in Desaix, he saw something different, something pure. He saw a man motivated by duty. Desaix never wrote complaining letters, unlike Napoleon's other generals. He never demanded titles or money. He simply did his job with superhuman competence. When Napoleon finally decided to abandon the army in Egypt in 1799 to return to France and seize power in the coup of Brumaire, he knew he was leaving a disaster behind. But he also knew that Desaix was one of the few anchors of stability in the entire colony. When Desaix finally signed a convention with the Mamluks and the British, allowing his own men to be honourably repatriated from Egypt, he sailed for France. He believed his duty was done. He had no idea what awaited him. His ship was intercepted by the Royal Navy, and he was held as a prisoner of war for a month, in violation of the treaty. The British Admiral, Lord Keith, treated him with suspicion. Desaix, the just Sultan, was furious at this perceived slight to his honour. When he was finally released and landed in France in April of 1800, he found a nation transformed. His friend, Napoleon Bonaparte, was no longer a general. He was First Consul. He was, in effect, the ruler of France, and he was in desperate trouble. Napoleon immediately summoned Desaix. He had secured his political power, but now he faced the second coalition. The Austrians had retaken Italy. The regime was fragile, his popularity hanging by a thread. He needed one massive, decisive victory to cement his rule. And to get it, he needed his most reliable general. He needed the man who had conquered the desert. He needed Louis Desaix. Desaix, loyal as ever, asked for only a few days to see his family, whom he had not seen in 2 years, before reporting for duty. Napoleon granted it, but urged him to hurry. The fate of France would be decided in Italy. The coup of Brumaire had been a success, at least on paper. In November of 1799, Napoleon Bonaparte had overthrown the corrupt and incompetent Directory, installing himself as First Consul. He was now the most powerful man in France. But this power was built on a fragile, trembling foundation. It was built on the promise of stability and, above all, the promise of victory. After a decade of revolution, terror and economic collapse, France was exhausted. The regime's enemies knew it. The second coalition, led by Austria and lavishly funded by British gold, saw its chance. If they could inflict one more decisive defeat on France, Napoleon's new government would shatter. The Jacobins would rise again in Paris. The Royalists would invade from the west. The entire revolutionary project would implode. And in the spring of 1800, that promise of victory was breaking. France was losing. In Germany, the French armies were in a difficult retreat, but the real bleeding catastrophe was in Italy. Italy, the very theatre of Napoleon's first, almost mythical triumphs in 1796, was now the scene of his greatest humiliation. The Austrian army, commanded by the 71-year-old Baron Michael von Melas, had systematically and brutally undone all of Napoleon's previous work. They had driven the French out of Lombardy. They had pushed them back across the Alps. And now, in May of 1800, Melas was besieging the last major French army in Italy. General Massena, one of France's toughest commanders, was trapped in the city of Genoa with his starving garrison, holding on by their fingernails, his men reportedly reduced to eating rats and leather. When Genoa fell, and it was clear it would fall within days, the Austrians would be free to invade southern France itself. Napoleon in Paris was politically cornered. He needed a victory. He needed it immediately. He needed a miracle. So Napoleon, looking at the maps in his study, conceived a plan of such breathtaking audacity that his own generals thought him clinically mad. The Austrians had two main routes into Italy. Melas, focused on crushing Genoa, had left his rear almost completely unguarded. His supply line stretched back east through Turin and Milan, a long, vulnerable tail. What if, Napoleon reasoned, he didn't attack Melas from the front, where he was expected? What if he took a new army, the army of reserve, and marched it not around the Alps, but over them? He would cross the Great St. Bernard Pass, a route considered utterly impassable for a modern army with artillery. He would descend like an avalanche into the Po Valley, landing directly on the Austrian supply lines. He wouldn't just defeat Melas, he would trap him. He would cut the Austrian army off from its homeland, forcing it to turn and fight a battle for its own survival. It was a checkmate move, if it worked. This is the moment immortalized by Jacques-Louis David in the famous painting, Napoleon Crossing the Alps. We see Bonaparte, the romantic hero, calm and composed, pointing to the heavens, mounted on a magnificent rearing charger, his cloak billowing in an alpine gale. It is, of course, one of the greatest and most effective works of propaganda ever created. The reality was nothing like it. The reality was mud. The reality was ice. The reality was desperation. And the reality was a mule. In mid-May 1800, the army began the ascent. Napoleon himself rode not a magnificent war horse, but a mule led by a local peasant guide, the only way to navigate the treacherous narrow paths. The soldiers, 40,000 of them, struggled upwards into the freezing cold. They were not all veterans. Many were raw conscripts, and this was their first taste of war. The greatest challenge was not the men. It was the guns. An army without artillery is an army that cannot win a major battle. But you cannot drag a 4,000-pound cannon up a goat track. So Napoleon's engineers, brilliant and desperate, improvised. They split the gun carriages from the barrels. They hollowed out massive pine logs, creating makeshift sledges. They encased the heavy cannon barrels in these logs, and then, 100 men at a time, they dragged them. They dragged them by hand. They dragged them through knee-deep snow, up slopes so steep they could barely stand. The soldiers were promised a significant cash bonus for every cannon they brought over, a practical solution that turned a military duty into a personal challenge. They sang revolutionary songs to keep rhythm as they hauled, their breath pluming in the freezing air, their hands bleeding. When the wheels of the carriages broke on the rocky paths, they were disassembled, and the pieces carried by hand. This was not a march. It was a feat of human engineering and raw, agonizing willpower. For 5 days the army was a single, struggling column, fighting gravity, fighting the cold, fighting the mountain itself. At the top of the pass, nearly 2,500 metres above sea level, the monks of the St. Bernard Hospice, who had been warned of their arrival, provided them with bread, cheese and wine. It was a moment of surreal calm in the middle of an impossible operation. Then came the descent, which was, in many ways, even more dangerous. They slid the massive cannons down the icy slopes, using ropes to control their speed, often losing their grip and watching helplessly, as a priceless artillery piece, a piece they had given their blood to bring this far, tumbled thousands of feet into a ravine. But they made it. Napoleon's army, complete with its cavalry and its cannons, had appeared in Italy, as if from the sky. The Austrians were completely, utterly surprised. The First Consul marched into Milan on June 2nd to a hero's welcome. He had successfully cut the Austrian supply lines. He had slammed the door shut behind Baron von Melas. He had trapped the entire Austrian army. The campaign seemed all but won, and it was at this moment of apparent triumph that Louis Desaix finally arrived. His journey had been an odyssey in itself. After signing the Convention of El Arish, which honourably repatriated the French army from Egypt, he had sailed for home, only to be intercepted by the British Royal Navy. Admiral Lord Keith, in a move of questionable legality, refused to honour the convention and declared Desaix and his men prisoners of war. For 30 days Desaix was held captive, fuming at this breach of military honour, writing furious letters of protest. When he was finally released, he landed in Toulon, a hero to the people, but a man in a hurry. He raced across France, desperate to rejoin his commander. He found Napoleon in Milan. The two men embraced. Their partnership, forged in the deserts of Egypt, was now renewed in the plains of Italy. Napoleon, overjoyed, immediately gave Desaix command of a corps of 2 divisions. He needed his most trusted man, his just sultan, for the final, decisive blow. But there was a problem. a terrible, fatal problem. Where was Baron von Melas? Napoleon had cut the Austrian supply lines, but the Austrian army itself had vanished. He had marched into Milan, seized the Austrian magazines, and slammed the door. But the enemy was not in the room. Melas had not panicked. Instead, he had concentrated his forces near the fortress of Alessandria, a strong position where he could either try to break out or wait for relief. Napoleon, a man whose genius was often impatient, grew nervous. He could not see his enemy, and an invisible enemy is the most dangerous kind. Was Melas trying to slip past him to the north, to cross the Po and escape? Was he marching south to relieve the siege of Genoa, not knowing Massena had already been forced to surrender? The fog of war descended, and Napoleon, the master of concentration, made a catastrophic error. He broke the first rule of warfare. He split his army. He sent divisions racing north, west, and south, trying to find an enemy who was sitting quietly just a few miles away, preparing to attack him. And the division he sent south, the one marching to block the road to Genoa, was commanded by Louis Desaix. On the morning of June 14th, Napoleon was at his headquarters, convinced the Austrians were in full retreat. He had even written to Paris the day before, assuring the government that the campaign was essentially over. He sat down to breakfast, confident in his own genius. He had no idea that at that very moment the entire 30,000-strong Austrian army was crossing the Bormida River, preparing to annihilate his overconfident, outnumbered, and dangerously divided forces. The trap Napoleon had set for Melas was about to spring shut on himself. Napoleon's fundamental error was not one of tactics, but of imagination. He had so thoroughly convinced himself of his own genius, of the elegant trap he had laid by crossing the Alps, that he simply could not conceive that the Austrians would do the one thing they had to do: turn and attack him. He woke on the morning of June 14th, 1800, in his headquarters at Torre di Garofoli, fully convinced that Baron von Melas was in a panicked, disorganized retreat. He was dangerously, catastrophically wrong. In his obsessive eagerness to catch this phantom army, he had committed the cardinal sin of warfare. He had divided his forces in the immediate face of the enemy. He had convinced himself that Melas would try to escape south towards Genoa, a logical assumption that failed to account for his opponent's own courage. And so he had detached one of his very best corps, a force of nearly 6,000 men, including the irreplaceable 9th Light Infantry, under the command of the one general he trusted most, Louis Desaix. He had sent them south on a fool's errand, to block an escape route that the Austrians had no intention of taking. He sent another division west under General Lapoipe. His main force, huddled in scattered positions around the small village of Marengo, was now dangerously thin, numbering perhaps only 22 or 23,000 men. They were not deployed for defence. They were organised for a pursuit. They were facing the wrong way, anticipating a chase, while the real danger was consolidating just across the Bormida River, hidden by the morning fog. As the first light broke over the Bormida, it was not a retreating Austrian rearguard that emerged. It was the entire Austrian army. 31,000 men, organised into 3 massive columns, supported by nearly 100 artillery pieces, began to file across the river's bridges. Their movements were slow, methodical, almost ponderous, a hallmark of the Austrian military machine. But they were relentless. Baron von Melas was not running. He was coming to fight. The French outposts under General Gardin were hit first around 9 o'clock in the morning. These men were taken completely by surprise. They had been told the enemy was fleeing, yet here was an entire army, deploying in perfect battle order. They fought bravely, using the farmhouses and ditches of the Marengo plain as cover. But they were not meant to stop an army. They were meant to be a tripwire. They were overwhelmed by the sheer, crushing weight of the Austrian advance. The alarm was sounded. Riders galloped frantically back to Napoleon's headquarters, where the First Consul was still at breakfast, his maps spread out, planning his imaginary pursuit. The news was almost incomprehensible. An attack? Here? Impossible. His first reaction was denial, then irritation. He believed it was merely a desperate probe, a rearguard action designed to slow him down. He sent orders to his divisions under Generals Lagne and Victor to advance and sweep them aside. He still had not grasped the reality of his situation. He was not the hunter. He was the prey. Napoleon rode forward, furious, still not grasping the scale of the disaster unfolding. It was only when he reached the front lines, ascending the small clock tower in Marengo village, and saw through his telescope the endless grey-white columns of the Austrian army deploying across the entire plain, that the cold reality hit him. This was no rearguard. This was the main event, and he was outnumbered, outgunned, and caught completely unprepared. His own divisions under Lannes and Victor were now in a desperate fight for survival. They deployed into line, veterans of the Italian and Egyptian campaigns, and met the Austrian assault with practiced discipline. But they were facing an enemy who not only outnumbered them, but who had overwhelming artillery superiority. The Austrian cannons, perhaps as many as 100 guns against Napoleon's meagre 15 or 20, began a systematic, brutal bombardment. The flat, open terrain of the plain offered no cover. The French line was raked with canister and round shot. For 2, then 3, then 4 agonizing hours, the battle was a horrific, grinding slugging match. General Victor's corps on the French left, centred on the village of Marengo itself, took the brunt of the assault. They used the stone farmhouses and garden walls as strong points, fighting with desperate courage. But the Austrians pushed relentlessly forward. General Lannes's corps to their right was stretched perilously thin, trying to prevent the Austrians from turning their flank. Slowly, agonizingly, the French line began to bend. Then it began to break. This was not a sudden rout. Not yet. It was a slow, grinding, bloody disintegration. The French fell back from Marengo village, which was taken and retaken, the streets choked with the dead. They gave ground one field at a time, one drainage ditch at a time. The retreat was orderly at first, with battalions leapfrogging each other, one firing a volley while the other moved back. But the Austrian pressure was relentless, and the French losses were horrifying. By 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the situation was catastrophic. The French army was no longer retreating. They were fleeing. They had been pushed back nearly 3, perhaps even 4 miles. The entire plain was a chaotic mass of broken units, exhausted men, and abandoned artillery. Napoleon's own consular guard, his elite citadel of 800 grenadiers, had tried to form a square in the centre to save the line. They held for a time an island of defiance in a sea of chaos, but they were surrounded by Austrian cavalry, blasted by cannons, and ultimately cut to pieces. The battle was over. Baron von Melas, the 71-year-old Austrian commander, watched from his horse as the last organised French units dissolved into a fleeing mob. He had been slightly wounded, a contusion on his arm. He was exhausted from being in the saddle since dawn, directing the methodical assault that had finally broken Bonaparte's arrogance. But he was undeniably, completely victorious. He had done what no general had done. He had beaten Napoleon Bonaparte in a major, set-piece battle. The French were routed. The road to Milan was open. The campaign was won. His victory was total. Confident that the pursuit of a broken enemy was a simple mopping-up operation, he handed command over to his Chief of Staff, General von Zach. Zach's orders were simple: pursue the defeated French, who were now little more than a disorganised rabble, and accept their inevitable surrender. Melas himself, weary but triumphant, rode back across the Bormida River to Alessandria. He took off his heavy boots, called for his surgeons to attend his wound, and began to dictate the victory dispatch. The message was to be sent immediately to the Emperor in Vienna, announcing the complete destruction of Bonaparte's army and the end of the war in Italy. In his mind, the day was already over. The Battle of Marengo was, definitively, an Austrian triumph. He had no way of knowing that miles to the south, the man who would undo everything was already marching, drawn not by an order, but by the sound of the guns. Miles to the south of this unfolding catastrophe, General Louis Desaix was, with his customary professionalism, obeying his orders. He was marching his corps, a force numbering approximately 5,000 to 6,000 men, including the famously disciplined 9th Light Infantry, away from his commander. His mission, as dictated by the First Consul himself, was clear: probe south towards the Scrivia River. He was to find the phantom Austrian army that Napoleon, in a fatal lapse of judgment, had become utterly convinced was trying to escape towards Genoa. The morning was already oppressively hot, the road dusty, the air thick and still. His men were marching steadily, their blue coats already dark with sweat. But there was an uneasiness in the air, a tension. The sounds from the north, from their rear, were wrong. It began not as a distinct sound, but as a low, distant vibration, the kind of concussion you feel in your chest and the soles of your boots before your ears can properly process it. Desaix, a veteran of countless battlefields on the Rhine and in the deserts of Egypt, knew the physics of combat. He knew the difference between the sharp, scattered cracks of a skirmish and the relentless, rolling, rhythmic thunder of a full-scale set-piece artillery bombardment. And what he was hearing from the north, that was not the sound of a pursuit. It was not the sound of a rearguard action. It was the sound of an entire army, his army, fighting for its very life. He gave the order to halt the column near the small village of San Giuliano. The men stopped, grateful for the respite, pulling at their collars, looking back over their shoulders. Desaix dismounted. He stood by the side of the dusty road, his scarred face tilted, his eyes closed, just listening. His officers gathered around him, their expressions a mixture of confusion and concern. Their orders were explicit: find the enemy to the south. That was the mission. But the sound, the terrible, growing, unceasing roar of perhaps 100 Austrian cannons, was coming from behind them. This was the defining test of a great commander, the moment that separates a good soldier from a battlefield genius. It is one thing to follow an order to the letter. It is another thing entirely, a far more dangerous thing, to know with absolute certainty when that order is catastrophically, suicidally wrong. Desaix was a man of profound, almost religious loyalty. He was a man of republican discipline. He revered the chain of command. But he was also a master of the battlefield's chaotic, fluid logic. He understood the military doctrine that would later be famously codified by his countrymen. A general who receives an order and finds that circumstances have changed must act as he presumes the commander-in-chief would act were he on the spot. But this was more than a change in circumstances. This was a complete reversal of reality. Napoleon had believed the enemy was fleeing. The guns proved the enemy was attacking. To continue south, meticulously obeying his last written order, would be to march dutifully into irrelevance. It would be to abandon his friend. It would be to abandon his army. It would be, in its own way, the deepest form of desertion. Yet to turn north, to wilfully, flagrantly violate a direct order from the First Consul of France, that was a gamble of almost unimaginable proportions. If he was wrong, if this was somehow a massive Austrian feint, a diversion, and the real Austrian army was to the south, as Napoleon had insisted, he would not just be court-martialed, he would be branded a traitor. He would be the man who lost the campaign because he thought he knew better than Bonaparte. The weight of this decision, in the span of perhaps 5 minutes, was the weight of France itself. Desaix looked at the road south, the path of his orders. He looked at the dust rising in the north, the source of the sound. He listened again for one last agonizing minute. The sound was not fading. It was growing heavier, more desperate, and it was moving. The sound of the battle was moving west, meaning the French line was not holding. It was being pushed back. He made his choice. He turned to his chief of staff, Anne Jean-Marie René Savary, a man who would later record this very moment for history. "The battle is lost," Desaix said. He did not say it with despair, but with the simple, terrible clarity of a surgeon diagnosing a fatal wound. Or it is about to be. He did not hesitate another second. He turned to his trumpeter. "Sound the recall." The notes cut through the hot air. "Sound the advance, to the north." The order was given. The entire corps, his 5,000 fresh elite soldiers, the men of the 9th Light who had followed him through the desert, turned around on the dusty road. They were confused, but they were disciplined. They trusted him. They faced the sound of the guns. They began to march. Not just march. They began to march fast. They marched toward the sound of the guns, toward the battle everyone else was fleeing. Desaix was acting on pure, terrible, tactical instinct. He was a soldier's soldier, a man guided by an almost supernatural faith in the logic of the battlefield. He had no confirmation. He had only the sound. Then, perhaps 30 or 40 minutes into their frantic march back towards Marengo, they saw him. A single rider, a horseman galloping towards them, his horse lathered in sweat and foam, its sides heaving. The rider's face was a mask of panic and dust. It was one of Napoleon's ADCs. He had been searching for Desaix, for any French troops, for over an hour. He carried a desperate scribbled note from the First Consul himself, written in haste as his army collapsed around him. The message was simple, almost a plea. For God's sake, come back if you still can. This moment is crucial to the legend and to the truth. The messenger did not cause Desaix to turn around. He found Desaix already on his way, already marching to the rescue for the better part of an hour. Desaix's intuition had been correct. He had not waited for the order. He had anticipated it. He had saved Napoleon from his own catastrophic blunder before Napoleon even knew he could be saved. Desaix barely glanced at the note. It only confirmed what the cannons had already told him. He handed it back, his decision already made, his corps already in motion. The march became a run. The men now understood. They were not probing for a phantom enemy. They were racing to save their army. The 6 miles that separated them from the battlefield were, without exaggeration, the most important 6 miles in French history. They could hear the battle clearly now, and it sounded like the end of the world, the chaotic, ragged sound of a broken army. But as they drew closer, they also heard something else, something even more terrifying, the sound of the French guns, falling silent. It was sometime between 3 o'clock and 4 o'clock in the afternoon. A lifetime had passed since the first Austrian cannons had opened fire. Desaix's division, nearly 6,000 men arrived not onto a battlefield, but into the middle of a disintegration. They were an island of order in an ocean of chaos. All around them, the main army was in full flight. Men were streaming past westwards, their faces blackened by powder, their eyes wide with the shell-shocked horror of defeat. Regiments had simply ceased to exist, dissolving into a running mob of terrified individuals. They shouted warnings to Desaix's men as they passed. "It's over. All is lost. The Austrians are coming." The ground was littered with the debris of a broken army. Abandoned knapsacks, discarded muskets, overturned ammunition wagons, and the bodies of the consular guard, who had sacrificed themselves in the centre. Through this torrent of retreating men, Desaix rode forward, his face grim, his uniform immaculate, despite his long journey. He found Napoleon Bonaparte near the village of San Giuliano. The First Consul was sitting on his horse, surrounded by his shell-shocked staff. The man who had crossed the Alps, the master of Europe, looked pale, almost listless, staring blankly at the wreckage of his army, as his political future, his life's work, evaporated in the Italian heat. He saw Desaix approach. He saw the fresh, disciplined lines of the 9th Light Infantry forming up behind him, a small, solid rock in the tide of chaos. Hope, or perhaps just desperation, flickered. Napoleon rode to meet him. Contemporary accounts differ on the exact exchange, but they all agree on the substance. Napoleon, his voice hoarse, asked his friend the simple, terrible question, "Well, what do you think?" Desaix, the just sultan, a man incapable of flattery or despair, glanced at the routed army streaming past them. He looked up at the sun, already beginning its descent. He reportedly, and quite coolly, pulled out his pocket watch. He surveyed the field. He saw the Austrians, victorious but now disorganized, advancing slowly, their columns spread out, already behaving like a force on a victory march, not one in a desperate pursuit. And he uttered the words that would echo through history, the words that saved an empire. "This battle," he said, "is completely lost." A pause, a devastating, honest assessment. "But," he continued, "it is only," and here reports vary, 3 o'clock, or perhaps 4 o'clock. There is still time to win another one. It was a staggering statement, an act of supreme tactical confidence. Desaix was not offering to save the retreat. He was offering to win. In that single moment, the entire dynamic of the day shifted. The despair in Napoleon's eyes was replaced by a familiar, dangerous fire. This was the language he understood. He did not need a subordinate. He needed a partner. And in Desaix, he had one. The two generals, in a frantic, inspired conference lasting perhaps only minutes, sketched out one of the most audacious counterattacks in the history of warfare. It would be a desperate gamble, an all-or-nothing throw of the dice, using the very last reserves of the French army. But it was a plan. The chaos now had a purpose. It had 3 parts, a trinity of destruction. First, the artillery. General Auguste de Marmont, Napoleon's trusted artillery chief, was given a frantic order. Gather every cannon that had not been captured or abandoned. Every single one. He raced across the field, rallying gunners, finding horses, manhandling pieces from the mud. He managed to scrape together perhaps 12, maybe as many as 18 guns. It was a pitiful number compared to the Austrian battery of 100, but they were all he had. These guns were to be massed into a single, secret battery just off the main road. They would hold their fire until the last possible second. Second, the cavalry. General François Kellermann, son of the revolutionary hero, commanded the army's remaining heavy cavalry. It was not much, perhaps 400, Some sources say 500 or even 600 sabres, weary from the morning's fighting. They were ordered to move unseen, to position themselves on Desaix's flank, hidden by the vineyards and mulberry trees that lined the road. They were to wait, to watch, to hold. Their moment would come, and it would be decisive. And third, the infantry, the core of the plan. Louis Desaix himself would take his fresh division, the 5,000 men of the 9th Light, and form them into an attack column. They were not to form a defensive line. They were not to hold their ground. They were to be the spearhead. They would advance directly into the teeth of the victorious, advancing Austrian army. It was a suicidal order for any other troops. But these were Desaix's men. They had followed him through the desert. They would follow him into hell. Napoleon, his energy restored, rode among the routers of his own army, shouting, pleading, threatening, using the sheer force of his personality to stop the panic. "Stand," he cried. "Here is Desaix. Fresh troops have arrived." He managed to rally a few thousand men, perhaps 3,000, from the broken divisions of Lannes and Victor. They were exhausted, terrified, and low on ammunition. But they stopped running. They formed a ragged, brittle line on either side of Desaix's fresh column. They would not be the attack. They would be the anvil. Desaix's division would be the hammer. The plan was set. A massed battery of 18 guns. A hidden flank of 400 cavalry. A spearhead of 5,000 fresh infantry. It was everything they had left. Across the field, the Austrians, completely oblivious, continued their slow, triumphant advance. General von Zach's lead column, 5,000 strong, marched confidently forward in dense marching formation, their bands reportedly playing, convinced they were just mopping up a defeated foe. They were not ready for a new battle. They were walking step by step into the most perfect trap of the Napoleonic Wars. The Austrian advance was no longer a military pursuit. It was a triumphant procession, a victory march. General von Zach's led column, 5,000, perhaps 6,000, of the finest grenadiers in the Austrian army, men who had fought with distinction all morning, marched forward with an almost parade ground arrogance. They were not in a battle line, ready to fight. They were in a dense, heavy, marching column designed to cover ground, not to repel an attack. Their bands, according to several accounts, were actually playing victorious tunes. Their officers, believing the day was won, chatted amongst themselves, perhaps already anticipating the promotions and honours that would follow the capture of Bonaparte's army. They were marching shoulder to shoulder, a perfect, dense, human target, utterly blind to the trap being laid just yards ahead. The remnants of Napoleon's army were in full, disorganized retreat before them. There was no threat. There was only the duty of mopping up, and then at a range so close it was almost suicidal, perhaps only 400 yards. The entire landscape in front of them erupted in fire, smoke, and screaming iron. General Auguste de Marmont, his face grim, his gunners standing by their matches, gave the single, brutal order. Fire! His massed battery of 12, maybe as many as 18 cannons, all that remained of the French artillery, erupted in a single, deafening, coordinated crash. This was not the solid round shot of the morning, designed to bounce across fields and break formations at a distance. This was canister. It was thousands of iron and lead musket balls, packed into tin cans that ripped apart upon leaving the muzzle. It was, in effect, a giant shotgun blast fired from the mouth of a cannon. The effect on the dense Austrian column was beyond description. It was not a volley. It was an amputation. The front ranks were not just killed, they were erased. They were physically blown apart, vaporized into a red mist of flesh and shredded wool. The men immediately behind them were scythed down in heaps, their bodies piling up, creating a grotesque, writhing barrier of the dead and dying. The column behind them, blind to what was happening, pushed forward, stumbling over the mangled corpses of their own comrades. The victory music stopped. The screams began. The entire column, 5,000 men long, halted in an instant, accordion-like, in total, blood-soaked confusion. They had no time to deploy. They had no time to form a battle line. They had no time to even understand what had hit them, or from where. The air was thick with sulphurous smoke, and through that smoke, before the Austrians could even recover their senses, before a single officer could bellow an order to deploy, the second blow fell. Louis Desaix, his sword held high, his voice clear above the din, was already moving. He rode at the very front of the 9th Light Infantry, the heroes of Upper Egypt, his immortals. His 5,000 fresh soldiers, men who had not yet fired a shot that day, let out a single, unified, terrifying roar. Vive la République! This was not a cautious advance. This was not a firefight. This was a charge. They did not fire scattered volleys from a distance. They advanced to point-blank range, perhaps 30 or 40 yards from the stunned Austrian ranks, and delivered one single, devastating, coordinated volley. The crash of 5,000 muskets at that range was like a second cannonade ripping into the already reeling Austrian formation. And then, before the smoke from their own volley could even clear, Desaix gave the final order. Fix bayonets, charge! He was at their head, leading from the front, a true Republican general, showing his men the way. The collision was brutal, intimate, and horrifying. The fresh, disciplined French infantry, moving with a desperate, pent-up energy, slammed into the stunned, bleeding, disorganized head of the Austrian formation. The Austrians in the front ranks, those who had survived the canister, fought back with the desperate courage of trapped men, but they were hopelessly compromised. They were trapped in their own formation, unable to deploy, being pushed from behind by their own men, who still didn't know what was happening. It was a bloody, compressed bottleneck of men stabbing, clubbing, and shooting each other in a space no wider than the road. And as Desaix's infantry pinned them in this nightmarish killing ground, the rallied remnants of Napoleon's morning army, the exhausted but inspired men of Lannes and Victor, saw the impossible happening. They saw the Austrians reeling. They stopped their long retreat. They turned. They formed ragged but functional lines on the flank of the Austrian column and began pouring volley after volley into their exposed side. Von Zach's column was now being shot to pieces from two directions and stabbed from the front. And it was in that perfect, terrible moment of maximum chaos, as the Austrian column wavered, its officers dead, its formation hopelessly compromised, its men screaming in terror, that General Francois Kellermann saw his chance. He had been waiting, his 400, perhaps 500 heavy dragoons and cuirassiers hidden in the vineyards and mulberry trees, their horses stamping, the men gripping their sabres, watching this entire drama unfold. He did not wait for an order from Napoleon. He did not wait for a signal. He saw the moment, the decisive, fleeting moment. He turned to his trumpeter. "Sound the charge!" His trumpet screamed the command. The heavy cavalry, men in shining steel breastplates, exploded from the trees and hit the Austrian left flank like a thunderbolt. This was the final, unanswerable blow. A formation of infantry, trapped in a dense marching column, being blasted by canister from the front, held in a horrific melee by a bayonet charge from fresh infantry, being shot at from their right flank by rallied troops, and now hit in the unprotected left flank by a full-speed charge of heavy cavalry. It was not a battle, it was a demolition. The Austrian grenadiers, the elite of the army, the victors of the morning, were utterly annihilated. The column did not retreat. It dissolved. In the span of perhaps 30 minutes, the entire lead element of the Austrian army was captured, killed, or scattered. Thousands of men threw down their weapons, raising their hands in stunned, total surrender. General von Zach himself, the man who had been leading the victory parade, was surrounded by Kellermann's troopers, his sword taken, a prisoner. The rest of the Austrian army, the columns marching behind Zach, watched their elite vanguard simply vanish in a cloud of smoke and steel. They saw French cavalry rampaging in their rear. They saw fresh French infantry advancing with bayonets. The psychological shock was total. The victory, so certain just an hour before, had turned into a nightmare. The army broke. The entire 31,000-man force, which had won the battle, was now a terrified, panicked mob, fleeing for their lives back towards the Bormida bridges. A single, horrifying bottleneck of chaos. The new battle was over. The day was won. Napoleon's career was saved. His legend was secure. The attack was a perfect, violent symphony of combined arms, an opera of destruction conceived in minutes. Marmont's cannons, the first movement, had ripped the head off the Austrian column. Kellermann's heavy cavalry, the second, was poised, hidden in the trees, waiting for the signal that would shatter the enemy's flank. And in the centre, the main movement, the infantry advanced. At their very head, riding his horse, was General Louis Desaix. He was leading from the front, just as he had always done, just as he had in the deserts of Egypt, just as he had on the battlefields of the Rhine. He was not a general who commanded from a safe hill, protected by a phalanx of staff officers. He was a soldier who led by example, who believed that a commander's place was in the place of maximum danger, sharing the risk with his men. His soldiers, the 5,000 veterans of the 9th Light Infantry, adored him for it. They saw him there, his scarred, earnest face set in determination, his sword raised, and they followed him without hesitation into the wall of smoke and Austrian fire. He shouted the order to advance, his voice cutting through the din. Allez, mes amis, go, my friends. The 9th Light surged forward, a blue wave crested with steel. The air was thick with lead. The Austrians, though stunned and bleeding from Marmont's cannons, were not broken. Not yet. They were veterans. They instinctively brought their muskets up, firing a ragged, panicked, but still dangerous volley into the smoke. And it happened. In the very first seconds of the charge, perhaps only minutes after 5 p.m., a single musket ball, fired almost at random from the reeling Austrian line, found its mark. It was an anonymous piece of lead, one of thousands flying through the air, fired by a soldier who would never know the consequence of his action, a man who was likely killed or captured just moments later. But this one bullet, in that 1 second, changed the course of history. It struck Louis Desaix directly in the chest. It passed through his heart. The force was catastrophic, the shock absolute. He was dead almost instantly, toppling from his horse onto the muddy, churned-up field. He did not speak. He did not cry out. He simply ceased to be. The man who had intuited the battle, the man who had reversed his division on a hunch, the man who had conceived the counterattack, was killed by one of the very first shots of his own victory. This was the moment, the pivot point of the entire Napoleonic Wars. This was the moment the counterattack should have failed. The moment the French line, seeing their just Sultan fall, should have broken in grief and terror. Had the men of the 9th Light, the men who had followed him through the heat and thirst of the desert, seen their commander, their father, killed before their very eyes, the charge would have stalled. Panic, far more infectious than courage, would have set in. The battle, the campaign, and Napoleon's future would have ended right there, in the mud, alongside Desaix's body. But they did not see him. In a crucial, almost superhuman act of battlefield presence of mind, Desaix's young aide-de-camp, General Jean-Marie René Savary, saw his commander fall. He understood instantly, in that microsecond of horror, what was at stake. He did not cry out. He did not stop to grieve. He did not hesitate for even a second. He and a few others in the immediate staff instantly leapt from their own horses. They grabbed the general's body, still warm, and pulled it unceremoniously to the side of the road, hiding it behind a small ditch or a cluster of mulberry trees. Savary threw his own cloak over Desaix's famous face, hiding the general's identity from the thousands of soldiers surging past them. The Ninth Light charged on, their eyes fixed on the Austrians, their momentum unbroken, screaming, "Vive la République!" completely unaware that their leader was already dead, lying under a borrowed cloak just yards away. The legend, which Napoleon himself would later encourage, tells a different, more romantic story. It is a powerful image, the one that made it into the paintings and the history books. It tells of the Ninth Light seeing their beloved general killed and consumed by a volcanic, vengeful rage, charging with supernatural, unstoppable fury to avenge his death. It's a compelling narrative, but the truth, as analysed by most modern historians, is likely more practical and, in many ways, far more impressive. The attack succeeded because the soldiers did not know their leader was dead. Their momentum, born of Desaix's own training and inspiration, their absolute faith in his plan, carried them forward. They were leaderless, but not aimless. They were the physical embodiment of his will, a weapon he had forged so perfectly that it could deliver the killing blow even after the hand that held it was gone. The terrible, tragic irony of Marengo is that Louis Desaix won the battle, but he was not there to see it. The battle raged on past him. Kellermann's cavalry charge, seeing the infantry engaged, broke the Austrian flank. The Austrian army disintegrated. The victory was total. Only later, hours later, as the pursuit began and the smoke started to clear, did the army learn the truth. Their saviour was gone. The legend also gives us his last words, whispered to his aide as he fell, a perfect epitaph for a Republican hero. "Go and tell the First Consul," he supposedly said, "that I die with the regret of not having done enough to live in posterity." This is, almost certainly, an invention, a piece of romantic propaganda crafted after the fact, perhaps by Savary himself, perhaps by Napoleon's mythmakers, to give a brutal, random death a poetic and noble meaning. The musket ball that struck him likely killed him far too quickly for any such eloquent speech. The reality was probably just a sudden impact, a gasp, and then silence. But the sentiment, whether real or invented, captured the essence of the man. A man driven not by a desire for fame, but by a profound, almost painful sense of duty. A man who, even in the imagined moment of his death, felt he had not done enough. The man who had done everything in the end felt he was still in debt to France. The sun set on the 14th of June, 1800, not over a glorious French victory, but over a field of carnage, confusion, and impossible, miraculous reversal. The Austrian army, which at 3 o'clock had been the undisputed victor, was now a shattered, terrified mob, streaming back across the Bormida, having lost thousands killed and wounded and, in the final tally, perhaps 6,000 to 8,000 prisoners. The victory was total. It was absolute. It was strategically decisive. Baron von Melas, the 71-year-old general who had been dictating his victory dispatch just hours earlier, was now a beaten man, trapped in Alessandria. He would be forced to sign the Convention of Alessandria just one day later, an armistice that effectively surrendered all of northern Italy, including the fortresses of Turin, Milan, and Genoa, back to France in a single stroke of a pen. Napoleon had won. He had saved his regime. He had secured his power as First Consul. Everything he had gambled for, he had achieved. But as the reports of this staggering victory poured into his headquarters at Torre di Garofoli, Napoleon Bonaparte was not celebrating. He was not drafting triumphant bulletins to Paris. He was not accepting the thunderous congratulations of his staff. He was isolated. He was silent. He was, by all contemporary accounts, in a state of profound and desolate grief. Sometime during the chaotic pursuit, after Kellermann's charge had broken the Austrian army, the body of General Louis Desaix had been recovered. It was found lying among the bodies of the 9th Light Infantry, the men he had led in that final, glorious charge. The fatal musket ball, the single piece of random lead that had changed history, had struck him clean in the chest, passing through his heart. The uniform, however, had hidden the wound. It was only when his aides, searching for him in the twilight, unbuttoned his coat that the small, fatal hole was found. He was dead. He had been dead for hours. When the news was brought to Napoleon, the First Consul, the master of Europe, the man who famously viewed his soldiers as cannon fodder to be expended in the mathematics of war, reacted not as a general, but as a man. He sat, staring at the cloak that covered his friend's body. And according to his private secretary, Bourrienne, who knew him better than perhaps anyone, he spoke with a genuine, uncharacteristic, almost private sorrow. "Why," he asked, his voice low, "am I not allowed to weep?" This is perhaps the most revealing, most human moment in Napoleon's entire complex career. This was not the theatre he so often employed for political gain. This was not a calculated display of emotion for the troops, who were, in any case, busy celebrating or collapsing from exhaustion. This was the raw, private grief of a man who understood, in that exact moment, the catastrophic price of his own ambition and perhaps of his own failure. Why wasn't he allowed to weep? Because he was Bonaparte. He was the First Consul. He was the living embodiment of French glory, and the architect of victory could not, must not, be seen to mourn the cost, as it would imply the cost was too high. He had to be the demigod, the man of destiny, the strategist whose plans were perfect. To weep would be to admit the truth, that the victory was not his, that his grand strategy had failed, that his career had been saved only by the sacrifice of a better, purer man. Napoleon's grief was not just personal, it was profoundly strategic. He understood power, and he understood the men who wielded it. He was, even then, surrounded by the men who would become his marshals. Men like Lannes, a lion in combat, but possessed of a volcanic, uncontrollable temper. Men like Murat, a peacock in a uniform of his own design, the greatest cavalryman of his age but consumed by vanity and ambition for a crown. Men like Bernadotte, a calculating Gascon, a schemer, a man whose loyalty was always, at best, conditional. Napoleon knew he was surrounded by brilliant, grasping, jealous rivals. He had forged them into the greatest military instrument in the world, but he knew they were wolves, held in check only by his superior will and his distribution of glory. Desaix had been different. He was the only one. He was the just Sultan of Egypt, a man of quiet, almost austere republican virtue. He was a man utterly indifferent to titles, to wealth, or to the gaudy trappings of power. He was perhaps the only truly loyal man in Napoleon's orbit, the only one whose ambition was entirely for France, not for himself. And his military talent was, in Napoleon's own estimation, immense. Perhaps the only talent he considered a potential equal to his own. He had once remarked that Desaix and another general, Kleber, were his only true lieutenants. They were the only two he could trust with a fully independent command, knowing they would not just obey, but understand. Kleber was now dead, assassinated in Egypt on the very same day Desaix fell at Marengo, a historical coincidence of staggering tragic proportions. And now Desaix was gone too. Napoleon had lost more than a friend. He had lost his right arm. He had lost the one man he could trust with an independent army, the one man who might have been capable of one day succeeding him, the one man whose loyalty was absolute. The victory at Marengo secured his political crown, but it cost him his greatest human and strategic asset. He knew, with the cold clarity of a strategist, that he would never find another Desaix. The price of his future empire, he must have realized that night, was an agonizing, permanent loneliness. And so Napoleon did the only thing he could. He immortalized him. He channeled his grief into myth. He ensured that Desaix's death was not in vain, but was woven into the very fabric of the victory, into the founding story of the new regime. He ordered that Desaix be given a hero's funeral, a grand procession through France. He commissioned monuments. He spoke of him constantly in his bulletins. But the most significant tribute, the one that truly revealed Napoleon's calculating, romantic, and strategic mind, was where he chose to bury him. Desaix was not buried in Paris, alongside the political elites. He was not buried at Les Invalides with the other military heroes. Napoleon ordered that Desaix's body be taken back to the Alps, back to the scene of the campaign. He was interred at the Hospice of the Great St. Bernard Pass, the very place the army had crossed in that impossible, glorious march just weeks before. It was a poetic, powerful, and deeply symbolic gesture. Desaix would rest forever at the highest point of the campaign, guarding the pass, his memory fused not with the bloody, compromised, rescued victory at Marengo, but with the clean, epic, romantic triumph of the Alpine crossing. He was forever frozen in time as the campaign's perfect hero, his sacrifice sanctifying the very beginning of Napoleon's imperial adventure. Napoleon succeeded, and the myth he began to build in the weeks and months after June 14th, 1800, would prove to be far more powerful, far more enduring, and ultimately far more important than the chaotic, desperate, and lucky truth. The victory at Marengo was the foundation stone of the French Empire, and Napoleon Bonaparte knew that foundations cannot be built on luck. They cannot be seen to rest on the unauthorized, insubordinate brilliance of other men. A foundation stone must be perceived as solid, flawless, and placed there by the singular vision of the master architect. So the architect began to rebuild his own battle. He would not just win the fight, he would rewrite it. This was not a simple act of vanity. It was a cold, calculated act of political necessity. A first consul who had seized power in a coup, a man building a legend of inevitable destiny, a man who needed to appear as a semi-divine genius to a nation desperate for order, cannot be lucky. He cannot be saved by his subordinates. He must be infallible. He must be destined. The truth of Marengo, that his strategic planning had failed utterly, that he had scattered his army, that he had been caught by surprise and comprehensively beaten by an enemy he dismissed, and that he had been saved only by the unauthorized return of one general and the inspired independent charge of another. This truth was politically unacceptable. It was poison to the myth he was building. And so, almost immediately, Napoleon Bonaparte, the First Consul, began the most sophisticated propaganda campaign of his entire career, a campaign waged against history itself. The very first Bulletin de l'Armée de Réserve, written in the immediate emotional aftermath of the battle, was by Napoleon's later standards surprisingly honest. It was drafted while the shock was still fresh, while the blood was still wet on the field, and while Desaix's body was still warm. In this version, Napoleon admitted the battle was hotly contested, and he gave Desaix enormous heartfelt credit, famously writing that the general's death was a great loss for France. It was a hero's eulogy for a fallen friend. But even in this first raw draft of history, the seeds of the myth were being sown. Napoleon was already minimizing the scale of the morning's disaster, presenting it as a stubborn, hard-fought contest, rather than the full-scale, 4-mile route it had truly been. This, however, was not enough. As the weeks turned into months, as Napoleon's power in Paris solidified, this narrative of a hard-won shared victory was simply insufficient. He needed Marengo to be a masterpiece, his masterpiece. And so the official history began to change, systematically, deliberately. The second official bulletin and the subsequent reports, histories and artworks commissioned by the state told a very different story, a story of pure Napoleonic genius. In this new, approved version, the morning attack by the Austrians was no longer a devastating surprise. It was merely an unexpected but not serious probe. And the French retreat, that desperate, chaotic 4-mile flight for survival, it was magically, brilliantly transformed into a feint, a planned tactical withdrawal. It was a brilliant, preordained manoeuvre designed by Napoleon himself to lure the overconfident Austrians forward, to stretch their lines, and to draw them into his real trap. The paintings he commissioned, like the famous one by General Louis Desaix, would not show the chaos and panic of 2 o'clock. They would show the First Consul serene and in total command, pointing the way to a victory that was never in doubt. And what of the heroes who had actually won the day? Their roles had to be adjusted. Louis Desaix was the easiest to manage. He was dead. A dead hero cannot contradict the official story. He cannot complain that his role has been diminished. He cannot write bitter memoirs. In the new narrative, Desaix's contribution was subtly but critically altered. His miraculous arrival, his intuitive, lonely decision to march his division to the sound of the guns against his explicit orders, was completely erased from the record. Instead, the bulletins and histories now claimed that Desaix was simply following Napoleon's perfectly timed instructions all along. He was not a saviour acting on his own initiative. He was merely a good, dutiful subordinate, arriving precisely when his commander's grand, complex plan required him to. His famous, despairing, honest quote, "The battle is lost, but there is time to win another," was suppressed. It was replaced with stories of his unwavering heroic devotion, culminating in his, almost certainly fabricated, poetic last words about dying for posterity. Desaix was transformed from the battle's co-architect and saviour into its most noble and most obedient martyr. His funeral at the St. Bernard Pass was not just an act of grief. It was a masterful stroke of propaganda, burying the hero far from Paris, high in the Alps, forever fusing his memory with the campaign's beginning, not with its messy, compromised and rescued end. But there was another problem, a living problem, a breathing, complaining and inconveniently heroic problem. General François Kellermann. Kellermann was very much alive. He was ambitious, he was proud, and he was angry. He knew, and his 400 troopers knew, that his charge, his unordered charge, was the tactical blow that had shattered von Zach's column and won the battle. He had seen the fleeting, perfect moment of Austrian vulnerability, and he had seized it. It was his Austerlitz, 5 years before Austerlitz. He expected, reasonably, to be named the hero of the day alongside the martyred Desaix. He expected a marshal's baton, enormous fame, and the undying gratitude of his first consul. He received almost none of it. Imagine the scene. Kellermann, his arm aching, his uniform caked in Austrian blood and dust, his sabre notched, rides up to the first consul after the charge, expecting a hero's embrace. Instead, Napoleon's response was famously, terrifyingly cold. He barely looked at him. "You made a pretty good charge," he reportedly said, his tone dismissive. Then he turned away. Pretty good? The insult was profound. It was a calculated political assassination. Kellermann, furious, did not stay silent. He complained openly in the salons of Paris. "I put the crown on his head," he was heard to mutter to his friends, referring to the political power Marengo had given Napoleon. This was dangerous, treasonous talk, and it cost him. Napoleon, a man who never forgot a slight and who detested rivals more than enemies, could not deny Kellermann his promotion. The victory was too public, and the cavalry's role too obvious. But he ensured Kellermann would never have such glory again. He never trusted him again. Kellermann was promoted to marshal, but he was never given the great independent commands. He was never given the glory that was heaped upon men like Davout, Lannes, or Masséna. He was, for the rest of his career, systematically sidelined. He was made an Inspector General of Cavalry, a prestigious-sounding but administrative, boring job. He was given commands of reserve units, far from the main action. He was a living, breathing, bitter reminder of the truth of Marengo. And Napoleon's new empire, built on the myth of his own infallibility, could not tolerate that. The myth was solidified. Marengo became his victory. The chaotic, desperate reality was buried with Desaix, and the inconvenient truth was exiled to administrative duties with Kellermann. Napoleon Bonaparte would go on to build an empire. He would win dozens of battles that bore his name and defined his legend. Austerlitz, Jena, Wagram. He would redraw the map of Europe and place crowns upon the heads of his family. But all of it, the crown, the empire, the code of laws, the legend, was built on the foundation laid on that desperate Italian plain. A foundation that had been bought not by his own infallible genius, but by the blood, intuition, and sacrifice of the one man he might have truly called a friend. The man who arrived just in time. The man who died just as victory was won. The story of Marengo is the story of the empire in miniature, a chaotic reality of chance and improvisation, brilliantly repackaged as a myth of inevitable destiny. And at the heart of that myth, buried beneath the propaganda, lies the body of General Louis Desaix, the just Sultan, the true architect of the victory, and the first, most noble victim of the empire he helped create.